Blood still stained the marble steps when the last of the conspirators lowered his dagger. 23 gaping wounds marred the body that had once commanded half the known world. But it wasn't the blades that killed Julius Caesar that morning of the Ides of March. It was the look of Marcus Junius Brutus, his adopted son, that pierced deeper than any forged steel. Et tu, Brute? And you too, Brutus? Were the words that echoed through Pompey's theater, not as a question, but as the lament of a man who had just discovered that absolute power is also the most absolute of solitudes. A few months earlier, Caesar walked the streets of Rome like a god among mortals. The triumph of Gaul still reverberated through the ancient stones of the eternal city. 60 years of life, more than half dedicated to the art of war and the seduction of power. His name echoed from the mists of Britannia to the sands of Egypt. Cleopatra, the most powerful queen in the known world, bowed before him not just out of political expediency, but out of genuine admiration for the man who rewrote the laws of the Republic with the same ease he conquered territories. Caesar's hands were the hands of a general, calloused, scarred, marked by decades wielding a gladius under scorching sun and freezing rain. His temples already showed the silver threads of experience, but his eyes retained the fierce glint of one who had never known ultimate defeat. When he spoke in the Senate, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 battles won. When he gestured, it was as if he commanded invisible legions. Rome bowed not only out of fear, but out of recognizing in him what few men in history possess, the ability to shape the destiny of entire civilizations. But power, that substance more addictive than any drug known to man, exacts its price in a currency that only reveals itself when it's too late to pay. And Caesar, in his meteoric rise to the top of the known world, didn't notice the cracks opening beneath his feet, not in the stones of Rome, but in the hearts of those he once called friends. The first crack appeared in the form of whispers, in the corridors of the Senate, in the public baths, at the banquets of the Roman elite. Cato the Younger, a man whose principles were as rigid as tempered steel, began to vocalize what many thought but few dared to say. Caesar had become too great, too dangerous. The Republic, that sacred creation of the ancestors, was agonizing under the weight of a single man. One man cannot be greater than Rome, Cato murmured in nocturnal meetings, his harsh voice cutting through the silence like a sharpened blade. One man cannot contain all the glory of a people. His words found resonance in the ears of Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man of frustrated ambitions and resentments cultivated like poisonous vines. Cassius had served under Caesar, had seen up close the brilliance emanating from that general transformed into a dictator, and this proximity, instead of generating loyalty, fueled a corrosive envy that gnawed at his soul like acid. But it was the adherence of Marcus Junius Brutus that transformed conspiratorial whispers into a concrete plan. Brutus, a descendant of the man who had expelled the kings from Rome and founded the Republic. Brutus, whom Caesar treated as a son, protected as an heir, loved as a continuation of himself. When Brutus joined the conspirators, it wasn't just one man who allied against Caesar, it was the living symbol of the Republic rising against the disguised monarchy. The meetings took place in discreet houses, far from curious ears and walls that whispered secrets to the emperor. Cassius spoke passionately about the dangers of tyranny, citing Cicero and the great orators who defined republican values. Brutus remained silent most of the time, the weight of the decision carving deep furrows in his young face. He knew that conspiring against Caesar was like conspiring against a god, but he also knew that allowing one man to become greater than Rome's institutions was to witness the funeral of liberty. Caesar, meanwhile, ruled from his palace on the Palatine Hill, surrounded by the luxury that his conquests had provided. Persian rugs covered the marble floors, Greek statues adorned the gardens, Nubian slaves served wines from the finest grapes of Gaul. But the luxury couldn't mask a truth that became more evident each day. Caesar was alone, absolutely alone at the pinnacle of his power. Calpurnia, his wife, tried to penetrate the emotional armor he had built over decades of military command. Her nights were populated by nightmares that he refused to share, cold sweats that made him wake up gasping, staring at the ceiling, as if expecting the gods to send signs through the stones. "Gaius," she whispered, "something is wrong in the air. I can feel it." But Caesar, accustomed to trusting only himself, dismissed feminine fears as the superstition of an idle mind. The omens, however, multiplied like crows before a storm. Haruspices, priests specialized in interpreting the entrails of sacrificed animals, reported ominous signs. They sacrificed bull after bull, and always the viscera revealed the same prophecy: death near, imminent betrayal, bloodshed in sacred places. Spurinna, the most respected soothsayer in Rome, approached Caesar one February morning and said with a trembling voice, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar laughed, that laugh that once echoed through the battlefields of Gaul when he defied gods and men. "Old wives' tales," he replied. But something in his eyes betrayed an unease that his words tried to mask. On the night before the Ides of March, Calpurnia awoke screaming. A terrible dream had visited her. She saw Caesar dead in her arms, blood staining his white toga, his vacant eyes fixed on the ceiling of Pompey's theater. "Don't go to the Senate today," she pleaded, clinging to her husband's muscular arm. "Something terrible will happen." Caesar hesitated. For a fleeting moment, the man who had conquered Gaul and defied Pompey considered staying home because of a woman's nightmares. But pride, that demon that dwells in the hearts of all great men, spoke louder. What will they say if Caesar misses the Senate because of a wife's dreams? The morning of the Ides of March dawned with a leaden sky, heavy clouds that seemed to contain the full weight of destiny. Caesar donned his finest toga, the one embroidered with gold thread that he had worn during his triumph in Gaul. Cruel irony, he adorned himself like a sacrificial lamb, unaware that he was marking his own immolation. Leaving his house, he found Spurinna waiting for him on the doorstep. "The Ides have come," Caesar said with an ironic smile. "They have come, but they have not passed," the soothsayer replied, and his words hung in the air like breath on a cold morning. The procession to the Senate was silent, a litter carried by Nubian slaves, lictors clearing the way with their fasces, citizens respectfully stepping aside. But something was different in the air. Greetings sounded forced, eyes avoided direct contact, conversations ceased as he approached. All of Rome seemed to know something that only Caesar ignored. Pompey's theater stood majestic against the gray sky, an imposing structure where the decisions that shaped the civilized world were made. Caesar descended from his litter and walked up the marble steps, each footfall echoing like a funeral drumbeat. The senators were already assembled, white togas forming a solemn semicircle, but there was tension in that immaculate white, a tension that vibrated like a lyre string stretched beyond the breaking point. Decimus Junius Brutus, a distant relative of his beloved Brutus, approached with a scroll in his hands. "Caesar, there is an urgent petition that requires your attention," he said, extending the document. It was the agreed-upon signal. Caesar bent to read, and it was in this moment of vulnerability that Cayce struck the first blow, a dagger piercing his back, cutting through muscle and hitting rib. Caesar cried out, not from physical pain, but from surprise, absolute surprise at discovering that men who had sworn loyalty could wield steel against him. What followed was not an execution, it was a carnage. 23 men, 23 daggers, 23 wounds opened in the body that had conquered half the world. Caesar initially tried to defend himself, his gladiator reflexes still functioning even in the face of impossible betrayal. He pushed aside one conspirator, tried to wrest a blade from another, his voice echoing through the theater. "What are you doing? What madness is this?" But there were too many, and the surprise had been complete. Casca opened a second wound in his neck. Cassius plunged his dagger into his abdomen. Cimber pierced the arm that was trying to protect his face. One after another, men who had eaten at his table, drunk his wine, received his honors, buried steel in his flesh. The marble floor, polished to a mirror shine, began to stain red, red that spread in ever larger pools, as if Rome itself was bleeding through its most illustrious son. Caesar stumbled, his white toga transformed into a blood-soaked shroud. The physical pain was unbearable. Blades had pierced his lung, opened veins, cut muscles, but the emotional pain was infinitely worse. He looked at the faces around him and saw men he had known since his youth, war companions, political protégés, transformed into murderous furies. He managed to murmur between gasps of blood that stained his lips, "Why?" The answer came in the form of more stabbings. Decimus Brutus, his son-in-law, Trebellius, who had served under his command in Gaul, Pontius Aquila, to whom he had granted honors after a hard-fought victory. Each blade that pierced his flesh carried with it years of pretense, false smiles, manufactured loyalty. Caesar was discovering, in the cruelest possible way, that power completely isolates a man, that at the top of the social pyramid, there are no friends, only self-interested individuals waiting for the right moment to bury their frustrated ambitions in the heart of whoever dared to fly higher than them. Stay tuned to this channel to discover more accounts that reveal the darkest and most defining moments of human history, where power, betrayal, and destiny intertwine in ways that still resonate in our time. But it was when Caesar saw Marcus Junius Brutus approach with a dagger in hand that something died inside him before the blade even touched his skin. Brutus, the young man he had raised as a son after Julia's untimely death. Brutus, whose studies in Athens he had financed. Brutus, whom he had gifted with lands in Gaul and a position in the Senate. Brutus, who bore the name of the founder of the Republic and now wielded steel against the man who had loved him most. A2. Brute. The words came out as a sigh, as the last breath of a man who had just understood the full extent of his solitude. It wasn't a question, it was a lament. The lament of a father who sees his son wield the blade of patricide. The lament of a mentor who discovers he has created his own destruction. The lament of a man who finally understands that conquering the entire world is worth nothing if you lose your humanity in the process. Brutus hesitated. For an eternal instant, dagger suspended in the air, the young man's eyes met Caesar's, and there, in that moment suspended between life and death, two souls recognized each other, that of the adoptive father, who had loved more than his own life, and that of the son who chose the abstract principles of the Republic over the concrete bonds of affection. Tears streamed down Brutus's young face, but his hand did not tremble as he plunged the blade into Caesar's chest. The 23rd and final wound was the deepest, not because Brutus's blade was sharper than the others, but because it carried the weight of filial betrayal. Caesar felt the cold steel pierce between his ribs, puncture his pericardium, lacerate the heart muscle that had pumped blood through 60 years of extraordinary life. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional agony of knowing that the man he had loved most in the world had chosen to kill him. He stumbled towards Pompey's statue, a cruel irony of fate that Caesar should die at the feet of the rival he had defeated in civil war. His legs could no longer support the weight of his body, riddled with 23 wounds. He knelt, then collapsed completely, blood forming a growing pool around his head. The toga that once symbolized absolute power now served only to absorb the crimson liquid draining away with his life. The conspirators remained motionless for a few seconds, daggers still drawn, staring at the result of their work. Caesar writhed on the marble floor, his breathing growing weaker, his eyes gradually losing focus. His body convulsed in involuntary spasms as vital organs failed. A punctured lung made each breath a desperate struggle for air. Blood pooling in his abdominal cavity pressed on other organs. Internal hemorrhaging drained his strength like sand through a broken hourglass. But Caesar's true agony wasn't in his shattered flesh, it was in his broken soul. As life ebbed away, his mind raced through decades of memories. A boy playing in the streets of Subura, a young man seduced by politics in the Forum, a general conquering impossible territories, a man captivated by the mysteries of Egypt, a dictator shaping the destiny of civilizations. Everything seemed small now, insignificant in the face of the absolute loneliness of that final moment. Cassius was the first to leave Pompey's theater, followed by the other conspirator. They left Caesar agonizing alone, his breathing echoing through the stone walls like wind through an empty tomb. The slaves who served in the Senate hid in dark corners, too terrified to approach the body of the man who had ruled Rome. Even the lictors, personal guards trained to give their lives for their charge, had fled in the face of the magnitude of the betrayal. Caesar died as he had been born, alone. But this final solitude was different from the solitude of birth. It was a chosen loneliness, earned through decades of pursuing power which, once obtained, proved to be a crueler prison than any dungeon. He had climbed so high that no one could reach him. He had become so powerful that everyone around him had become a potential enemy or a self-serving flatterer. In the end, the man who had conquered the world discovered that he had lost himself in the process. His last thoughts, as consciousness dissolved like salt in water, were for Cleopatra, the only person in the known world who had loved him for who he was, not for what he possessed. The woman who had shared his bed in Egypt, and understood that behind the conqueror's armor there was only a man haunted by the constant need to prove his worth. But Cleopatra was thousands of miles away, ruling on the banks of the Nile, unaware that her Roman lover was agonizing in a pool of his own blood. News of the death spread through Rome like wildfire. Citizens poured into the streets, some shouting with joy at the liberation from tyranny, others lamenting the loss of the general who had brought glory and wealth to the empire. Markets closed, temples filled with contradictory offerings, some thanking the gods for the tyrant's death, others imploring forgiveness for the hero's murder. Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, was at home when a breathless slave brought the impossible news. Caesar dead. Impossible. Caesar does not die. But when he arrived at Pompey's theater and saw the shattered body of the man he had faithfully served for decades, Antony collapsed in convulsive weeping. He wasn't just weeping for the loss of his commander, he was weeping for the death of an era, for the end of a world where men could shape destiny through will and sword. Octavian, Caesar's grand-nephew and designated heir, received the news in Apollonia, where he was studying rhetoric and military strategy. An 18-year-old, he did not yet fully understand the political implications of the assassination, but something within him, that intuition that separated future emperors from ordinary mortals, whispered that the world had changed forever. That the republic for which Brutus had killed Caesar was already dead before the blades touched the dictator's flesh. Calpurnia was informed by a centurion who could barely speak. She collapsed in the atrium of her house, her cries of anguish echoing through the marble halls where the fragrances of Caesar's favorite perfumes still lingered. It wasn't just widowhood, it was the confirmation of all the nightmares that had haunted her in recent months. Her feminine instincts had detected the danger that Caesar's masculine arrogance had refused to see. The body remained in Pompey's theater until Antony and other loyalists arranged for its removal. When they finally transported it, they had to completely cover the blood-soaked toga to prevent the sight of the wounds from causing riots in the streets. All of Rome wanted to see the man who had become a legend, but the reality of death was too grotesque for public display. The funeral became an event that sealed the fate of the Republic. Antony delivered a funeral oration that inflamed the populace against the conspirators. He displayed the toga pierced by the 23 stab wounds, each hole telling a story of betrayal and ingratitude. See how they rewarded the one who gave them glory, wealth, and territories, he cried, his voice carrying all the rage he had accumulated since the moment he found his friend's body. The enraged mob took to the streets, looking for the assassins. Cassius had already fled east. Brutus was hiding on a rural estate outside Rome. The other conspirators scattered to the four corners of the empire, discovering that killing a tyrant is easier than dealing with the consequences of tyrannicide. They had freed Rome from Caesar, but they had not been able to free Rome from the need for Caesar. The bitter truth, one that Republican idealists refused to accept, was that Rome had outgrown its ancient institutions. The empire, stretching from Scotland to Sudan, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, could no longer be governed by senators endlessly debating, while provinces revolted and enemies massed at its borders. Caesar wasn't the cause of the Republic's death, he was the inevitable consequence of a growth that made Republican government impossible. The civil war that followed his assassination was bloodier than all of Caesar's campaigns combined. Mark Antony and Octavian hunted the conspirators across the Mediterranean, and the famed Battle of Philippi sealed the fate of the last Republicans. Brutus, the adopted son who had turned his sword against his father, fell on his own blade, realizing he had destroyed precisely what he had tried to save. Cassius, the conspiracy's mastermind, also took his own life, understanding that he had traded a capable dictator for the anarchy of incompetent men. The Republic never recovered. Octavian, renamed Augustus, became Rome's first official emperor, inaugurating a political system that would last over 500 years in the West and 1500 in the East. Caesar died believing he had destroyed the Republic, but in reality, he had created something new, a form of government that combined autocratic efficiency with popular legitimacy. His assassins, attempting to restore a dead past, only hastened the arrival of the inevitable future. Caesar's body was cremated in the Forum, his ashes placed in a mausoleum built by Augustus, but his true legacy wasn't in his mortal remains, it was in the irreversible transformation he had imposed on the known world. He had demonstrated that an extraordinary man could transcend the limitations of ordinary institutions. He had proven that personal leadership, when coupled with clear vision and unwavering determination, could shape the destiny of entire civilizations. Centuries later, Roman emperors would still use his name as a title. Caesar, Kaiser, Sane, contours of later eras would study his military tactics, politicians would analyze his power strategies, and philosophers would debate the moral implications of his rise and fall. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of his entire story is that Caesar, the man, remained eternally misunderstood. His enemies saw only a power-hungry tyrant. His admirers saw only an invincible demigod. Few perceived that behind the dictator's mask was a profoundly lonely man, haunted by the constant need to justify his existence through grand achievements. Caesar conquered territories because he needed to prove his worth. He accumulated power because he feared insignificance. He defied gods and men because he couldn't accept the limitations of ordinary mortality. The morning of the Ides of March was the moment when this solitary march toward greatness met its inevitable end. 23 blades shattered not only flesh and bone, but also the illusion that absolute power could provide absolute security. Caesar discovered too late that climbing to the top of the human pyramid means accepting total isolation, and that this isolation, sooner or later, becomes the weapon his enemies would use against him. Caesar's death wasn't just the end of an extraordinary life, it was a revelation about the corrosive nature of unchecked power. It showed that a man could conquer the entire world and still die utterly alone. It proved that historical greatness doesn't protect against human frailty. It taught that the most painful betrayal always comes from those we trust most. But perhaps the deepest lesson is that Caesar, even shattered by 23 stab wounds, even dying in absolute solitude, even betrayed by those he loved, still managed to transcend his own mortality. His name echoed through the centuries, not because he was the perfect dictator, but because he was an imperfect man who dared to dream of perfection. He died discovering that grand dreams always exact cruel prices,
but also that some dreams are too big to die with those who dreamed them. In the end, Caesar achieved what he most secretly desired: immortality, not physical immortality, which the conspirators' blades made impossible, but the immortality of example, both of what can be achieved when one dares to challenge human limits, and what is lost when that daring turns into arrogance that ignores the fundamental limitations of mortal existence. The blood dried on the marble of Pompey's theater, but the questions he raised continue to flow through the centuries. How much power can a man accumulate before that power destroys him? Is it possible to be great without being lonely? Is it worthwhile to conquer the world if the price is losing one's soul? Caesar died without answering these questions, leaving them as a permanent legacy for all of humanity that came after him.